Well, hi everyone. Today I want to do an update on the I-40 reconstruction repair work that's ongoing in western North Carolina. In early December 2024, they had quite a setback with an additional slope failure. It occurred as they were trying to continue with the repairs. So I'll go over what the latest is in terms of the reconstruction, but also I want to provide a little more historical context for how this section of I-40 was constructed in the early 1960s to mid 1960s, opened up in this area in 1968. And also, I think more importantly, I want to provide some framework for what I think ultimately needs to happen here. I mean, I'll just tell you now, I think their efforts to essentially restore two-way traffic in one set of lanes makes sense from a temporary or interim standpoint, but not only will it be tremendously difficult and time-consuming and expensive to repair this entire section, restore it to full capacity, four lanes total, two in each direction, I think is a mistake. And I'm going to tell you why I think that is in this video. So let's just look at some of this news footage here. You can see they're in the process of installing soil anchors. They call them soil anchors. They're actually going into rock. You see they've got an upper course because they do this work in a top-down fashion where they've got these anchors in the very upper portion of the slope, and they've already installed shotcrete to provide some erosion protection. But then they had subsequent failure, and they were attempting to reopen this section of road to two-way traffic in the first of 2025. So a tremendous amount of work here. Access is very limited. North Carolina DOT has indicated that they've been impacted or their efforts have been slowed due to what they call non-essential travelers going through the area. But it's a very remote area here. You can see they can't really bring in a lot of equipment just because of the limited access in any given area. North Carolina DOT had this press release that they published on December 20th, 2024, warning of additional slide delays on I-40 reopening. Now, fortunately, they were aware that this section of roadway was going to open up again, and nobody was hurt. It was pretty obvious that there was going to be some movement there. So they were prudent to shut this construction down in this area. So about a 100-foot section broke away. So that's going to impact their ability to quickly restore two-way traffic, one lane in each direction. Some more details associated with this press release talk about the additional section of roadway that failed. And the DOT representative saying it's a new hurdle that we have to overcome in order to provide a safe facility for the traveling public. Repair efforts have been hampered by wet weather and freeze-thaw conditions, which they believe contributed to this latest slide. This is the area that we're talking about. You can see all the road closure markers along I-40 as you cross from Tennessee into western North Carolina. Another view of that section in more detail. This original section consists of 22 miles along the roadway. And as I mentioned, they started design work in the late 1950s, but construction progressed from the early 1960s and was completed in 1968 for this section. And you can see the current roadway status, still a number of closures throughout North Carolina, as well as planned construction in several other areas. So Wright Brothers has the emergency contract with North Carolina DOT to get this section of roadway restored and open to traffic, and they have a subcontractor, GSI. They do a lot of work with slope stability measures, whether it's soil nails, rock anchors, that sort of thing, protection from rock falls. So this is what they are doing. You can see they're drilling in these anchors, and DOT indicates that they're going to go a minimum of 5 feet into bedrock. And you can see the track mounted drill that they're using to advance these anchors. View of that. It's rather slow work. So let's just look at an animation I got from the GSI website. Shows you, in this case, they're showing them shooting in the anchors. In this case, in North Carolina, they're drilling them in. And they start at the upper portion of the slope, and then they'll work their way down slope. But after they install these anchors, they come in and install grout to fill the annular space between the anchor and the ground. And then after that, they put high strength reinforcing bars inside the anchors. And then they'll apply shotcrete covering for erosion protection. This is the same type of repair that was done in Wyoming on the Teton Pass, although they're not done with their rebuild. But they had a massive section of embankment, I think a section that collapsed overnight. And unfortunately, they didn't seem to recognize that this failure was imminent. Unfortunately, nobody was hurt. But you can see this is from October. They were installing these soil anchors in a top-down fashion, and these anchors were connected with a steel mesh, and then the shotcrete facing was applied. So as we know, this section of I-40 is very rugged and remote, and it's in a valley along the Pigeon River. So there's steep side slopes on either side of this highway section, and the highway section primarily consists of embankment fill. So let's go through here. There's a good article. I've got a link to this in the description from the Mountaineer. This was published in 2010. It's a history of this I-40 section along the Pigeon River. Overall, the construction costs were about $1.5 million a mile in mid-60s. So that would be 10 times more in today's dollars, so $15 million a mile. And I can tell you, you can't just simply convert what it costs to construct originally into today's dollars and get anywhere close to what it costs these days. There's environmental issues, there's constraints with a lot more development, a lot more traffic. It's just much harder to do repair work in these scenarios or rebuild work than it was to basically put it in for the first time. So let's look at this section. As the crow flies, it's about 16 miles, but along all the twists and turns, it's about 22 miles. You can see some photos from this mid-60s construction. Appears that they're doing on-site processing of borrow material, or at least nearby processing, which makes sense because those haul distances are rather long if you come in at from either end of the section. Again, showing the height of some of these fill slopes. Now here's a chronology of this construction. So in late 1950s, they started working on drainage and design of the tunnels. They did a variety of studies. Looks like there was some disagreement with congressional funding from Tennessee, but obviously they got that worked out. So it just goes through the various sections, and they opened up the last bit of it by paving in September 1967. So as we can see, North Carolina DOT really has their work cut out for them merely to restore half the traffic capacity than what they had originally. So 2 lanes instead of 4 lanes. And to me, it doesn't make a lot of sense given the vulnerability of this highway section as proven from the events of Hurricane Helene back in September 2024. And, I was really influenced by this book. I mentioned this book in a previous video, but Nassim Taleb's Antifragile book, I think, is a real eye-opener. And the concepts in this book can be applied to a variety of industries, but in particular, I think our civil infrastructure needs to become far more what he calls anti-fragile, or at least robust. And what we have in many cases is a very fragile transportation system in particular. So what we saw here was a massive rain and flood event that washed out embankment fill sections for this highway, this Interstate I-40 in western North Carolina. And it just simply doesn't make sense now that we see how vulnerable this section of roadway is to massive rain events and that produce flooding. Now, I've heard from some of you in comments to my previous videos on this I-40 situation that this route along the Pigeon River was selected due to political considerations more so than engineering considerations. I'm still researching that for myself, but from an engineering standpoint, clearly this 22-mile section along the Pigeon River is very vulnerable to these types of events where you have high rainfall events and these very steeply sloping hillside areas adjacent to the embankment fill sections. And the other key aspect of this anti-fragile book is that events, what we call extreme events, such as what happened with Hurricane Helene, typically occur far more frequently than anticipated. And a shorthand way of referring to that, and this idea is used in investment banking as an example, and that's what's called a fat-tailed distribution. And I'll just read this really quickly and I'll show you a plot. A fat-tailed distribution is a probability distribution that exhibits a large skewness or kurtosis relative to that of a normal distribution or an exponential distribution. In common usage, the term fat-tailed and heavy-tailed are sometimes synonymous. Fat-tailed is sometimes also defined as a subset of heavy-tailed. Different research communities favor one or the other largely for historical reasons and may have differences in the precise definition of either. Fat-tailed distributions have been empirically encountered in a variety of areas: physics, earth science, economics, political science. The class of fat-tailed distributions includes those whose tails decay like a power law, which is a common point of reference in their use in scientific literature. However, fat-tailed distributions also include other slowly decaying distributions, such as the log normal. So let's look at a curve here that makes a little more sense, I think. So the light green line is the normal distribution plot, and then the dark green line is a distribution from, say, a power law. And if you look at the extreme events, per a normal distribution, the likelihood of having that extreme event is shown to be quite low, when in fact many things in nature and in human society, these so-called extreme events occur far more frequently than anticipated, just like what we had with the rain and flooding and erosion and damage to I-40 in western North Carolina. Now, it was a massive amount of rain that came through here with Hurricane Helene. Some places recorded as much as 30 inches of rainfall in a 3-day period, the time it took for this hurricane to pass over North Carolina. Now let's look at what the National Weather Service said for the probability of this type of rain event. And again, there's a link to this source in the description if you want to check it out. But you can see the Asheville area, it's shown in black. So the chance of exceeding that amount of rainfall that occurred with Hurricane Helene over a 3-day period is 1 in 1,000. But obviously, I think it's highly unlikely that it's truly a 1 in 1,000 event. And I think this is a classic example of a fat-tail distribution where the probability of occurrence for an extreme event is far higher than what people had originally expected. I mean, there's been many, many other hurricanes that produced tremendous amounts of rainfall in North Carolina. This is the track of Hurricane Hazel. And of course, Hurricane Hazel was in 1954. It predates the construction of this section of I-40 along the Pigeon River. But that's another issue that you have. You may have people relying on historical precipitation and flood data to make estimates about what's likely to occur in the future, but they also need to factor in the amount of development that's occurred or is likely to occur in the future. So for that reason, it's extremely difficult to predict the likelihood of a so-called extreme event. Now I just want to show some footage from back in September. It just shows you the force of this water, this tremendous volume of water coming through. And I don't see how somebody could say, yeah, this is a 1 in 1,000 event, so let's rebuild and hope it never happens again. I think that's foolish. That's not the way to construct a robust infrastructure system, in my opinion. A few more images of this, just widespread erosion. And quite frankly, I don't understand how they expect to restore this highway to 4 full lanes if they're going to install 2 lanes initially, open it up to traffic. I don't see how you can possibly haul in enough material without dramatically impacting the traffic. I think it may be a reopened 2-lane section of roadway in name only. I mean, you can't really do both, in my opinion. So what I think needs to happen here is they reopen the highway to 2 lanes and they come up with an alternative route for this section of I-40. So just as a thought experiment, let's consider the amount of fill material that may need to be brought in to restore this highway section to permit the reconstruction of 4 lanes along this 22-mile stretch of I-40. And I don't have super detailed information. In fact, I don't have any detailed information from the DOT or local media sources. So I just want to show you conceptually how you could go about just getting a rough estimate of the amount of material and the time it's likely to take to restore this embankment. So let's say we've got 2 new lanes that we have to rebuild. The other 2 lanes have been restored to two-way traffic, but they want to get the highway to its pre-Helene condition. So let's say we've got 2 12-foot lanes, and let's say we've got a 6-foot shoulder on either side, 36-foot width that has to be restored. And let's just say on average the height of fill that needs to be brought in is 25 feet. And let's say there's 5 miles total that has to be rebuilt. So that's about 880,000 cubic yards of fill. So to conceptualize that, let's take a typical 16-yard truck. That's 55,000 16-yard truckfuls of material that has to be driven to the site, and then the truck has to be unloaded, the material has to be placed, and then the empty truck needs to go back to the borrow area. And I can't imagine them making that many truck trips in a given day if they'll simultaneously try to maintain two-way traffic on the only access that they have to bring fill in. It just makes no sense to me. So again, I think for this reason, they need to strongly look at an alternate route. So if you look at the original construction costs in today's dollars of $15 million per mile, and there was a 22-mile section, that's $330 million in today's dollars if you were to build it all from scratch. But obviously we know that things are far more expensive today than they were back in the early to mid 60s. So let's just double that cost. So we're pushing $1 billion, I think, to completely reconstruct this section. I think a minimum of $500 million, so $500 million. And just as a rough estimate, to reroute this section of I-40, probably involving construction of new tunnels, you're probably looking at the $2 to $3 billion range. But if you did that, you could construct a highway section that is actually robust and would be insensitive to future massive flood events that are similar to what occurred with Hurricane Helene. So let's take a look at another example. You have the Fukushima Daiichi plant north of Tokyo, Japan. It has a total of 4 reactors. All 4 reactors sustained massive damage from a tsunami in 2011. Now the reactor design was a GE boiling water reactor, and it's a 1960s design. And as you know, reactors are fueled with uranium-235, which produces a tremendous amount of heat, and water has to continuously circulate to remove that excess heat. And if that doesn't happen, the water turns to steam and you can have an explosion and a meltdown of the fuel rods, which is a very disastrous scenario. Because these old reactor designs rely on active pumping of water for cooling, whereas more modern designs have what they refer to as passive systems. So if there was a power failure or mechanical failure, cooling could still be provided to the reactor. Well, this plant is entirely closed now in Japan, and you don't hear somebody saying, you know, we need the power, let's just rebuild the exact same kind of plant in the same area. I mean, you're always going to have tsunami and earthquake risks in Japan, and they need power, but I don't think anybody in their right mind would propose rebuilding it just the way it was in the 1960s. So for that reason, in a similar fashion, it makes no sense to me to restore all 4 lanes along I-40 in western North Carolina. So please let me know what you think in the comments section. I want to send a shout out to the channel members. I really appreciate your ongoing support, and many of you channel members reach out to me with story ideas and other input, which I greatly appreciate. Also, I appreciate the support of those of you who provided super thanks. That's another great way to support the channel. And to round it out, I started Buy Me a Coffee last month, and that's gotten a great response, and I really appreciate that. I get to retain more of the proceeds with Buy Me a Coffee relative to YouTube, but again, I appreciate all forms of support for this channel. I've got many interesting topics coming up in the future, so If you have any other story ideas, please email me at info@ftnc.com, and please leave your comments to the videos. Thanks very much.